I just think there's been so much history, so many memories. This place is really, really important to people.
Memorial Stadium defines athletics at the University of Nebraska.
Here's a hand up to Thunder, who gives it back to Mike Stokes. He's going to throw it. He's got a man out. Yeah!
Third largest city in the state when it's full, right?
Anyone can build a stadium. What you put into it, what you say you stand for, is more a statement of who you are as a people.
Really remarkable when you think about the guts and bones of a place that's 100 years old.
You can see how it's changed from decade to decade, and yet it still stands, and it's still one of those iconic places that people still want to get to. So yeah, absolutely, it's got its place in America.
When someone is losing their eyesight, they might think that their world is ending. Blindness does not have to be a tragedy or stop them from being independent and contributing to society. The Nebraska Commission for the Blind and Visually Impaired believes that with training and opportunity, blind people can still enjoy life because the joy of life does not depend on our eyes, but how life is lived. For information about services, 877-809-2419 or ncbvi.nebraska.gov.
Taking the good with the ups and downs. I wanna see how the world turns round. Let's go adventure in the deep blue sea. Home is with you wherever that may be. Home is with you wherever that may be.
Well, my earliest memories are playing youth football, actually, and seeing some of the red balloons. You're in a huge stadium, lots of people, lots of red. You know, and that's really what I remember as a kid, is coming into the stadium and just seeing, you know, the sea of red, how many people were really rooting on the team, feeling the same way. And that hit me, that hit me pretty good. There's a lot of history. It goes back a long ways. I mean, it's hard to find another college football program that has won as many games as Nebraska over time. Filled the stands as many years in a row with the sellouts. Done it in a first-class fashion. And so to me, that's special.
In Lincoln, Nebraska, the skyline is home to a college football cathedral. For 100 years, Memorial Stadium has become a place that has bound the state together. It has been a mecca of the sport, a destination for all college football fans to journey to. As it reaches a centennial celebration, this venerable venue continues to expand and change. On Saturdays in the fall, the 90,000 Big Red faithful that fill the stadium make it the third largest city in Nebraska. A true blue blood of the sport, the Cornhuskers have called Memorial Stadium home since 1923. In that time, They've celebrated wins that put them on top of the college football world and losses that left the cavernous structure silent. And while good old Nebraska U is synonymous with the stadium, the football team began its history on a dirt field on the edge of campus.
Nebraska had a chancellor in the 1890s named James Canfield, and Canfield and Roscoe Pound together really promoted the idea of football. They wanted it to be successful because they knew it would unify people in support of the university. It was really pretty brilliant when you think about it, because it was kind of unknown up until the late 1880s. It was a brand new sport. Football immediately became very popular. In the northwest corner, where T Street and 10th Street come together, there was a dirt field. And for years and years, it was the ROTC, which wasn't really called ROTC yet, but the military field, and where they would march and do their drills, and the military band practiced. And then when football was born in the 1890s, that became the football field.
They played on a field that was basically, you had to go, before the game, you had to go into the field and throw the rocks off and clear it off. It was in such bad shape.
That didn't last very long, and it became clear after just a couple of seasons that they had to move. So then they jumped over T Street and created Nebraska Field in 1908.
Nebraska Field. It ran east and west. It was located basically to the south of where Memorial Stadium is now. There was a grandstand on one side and bleachers on the other, I believe. And it held about 10,000 people. They played the first game there in 1909. They had good crowds, good response there. Because of its location, sometimes, kids could watch games. They could climb up a tree, or, there were coal piles, and with the railroad not too far away and so forth. There were other ways to watch. You didn't necessarily have to have a ticket, but it was a good facility for the time.
During that 13-year stretch, the world was changing around the growing campus and the program. Conflict grew across the globe, and the United States entered World War I in 1917. The resulting loss of American lives would top 116,000. From those losses sprung the seeds of memorials across the country to honor those fallen soldiers.
The team captain for the football team, his name was Roscoe Dusty Rhodes. He had been chosen by the 1917 football team to be their captain for 1918. In April, he decided to go and enter the military as a sergeant. On October 25th in 1918, he was actually killed in action in France. We just came from this really sobering experience of World War I. And, that was a stressful time. It was a stressful time for, the United States, for the world, particularly on campus.
There was a national movement after World War I to build memorial structures. There were, 20 or 30 schools in the process of building a memorial building. It was a movement that kind of swept through academia from coast to coast.
I believe there was a great kind of coming of age, kind of can-do attitude that kind of permeated the whole country at that time. I think they really had the confidence that if they put their mind to it, anything was possible.
They had really big plans for this building, right? And it was going to have the memorial, and that would be a rotunda area, colonnades. There would be a museum that you could put artifacts from the different war periods, because they'd started to think beyond just World War I. They were going to have, of course, the football field, indoor track. So it really became this giant thing.
They used a couple of methods to fund it, but the main one was a system of pledging.
And they got some funding that way. But then there was kind of an economic downturn in Nebraska. That stopped the fundraising for about 6 months, from about 1920 to 1921. No fundraising, they were just done. And that's when they decided there will be no colonnades on either end of the stadium. And I think that's when they kind of abandoned the idea of the museum as well. So there was a challenge over the course of numerous years to get the money from the pledges. It wasn't until close to 1940 when they actually closed the books and had actually paid for all the money that they intended to have for the stadium, which was about $450,000.
Groundbreaking was in April of 1923.
It's very labor intensive to build a poured in place concrete building, which is exactly what the original Memorial Stadium is. It's the core of the stadium on the east and the west side.
The construction company had 89 days to complete the project. They lost 31 days to weather. It was an issue. So it went up pretty fast.
The design of the building is interesting in that it's very typical of its era. The late 19th and early 20th century saw architects and architecture in this country not exclusively, but heavily based in what is known today as neoclassical architecture. And here's where the Capitol and the stadium share some talent. The Capitol was started under construction a good year before Memorial Stadium was begun. And that was enough time to bring in a man from the university, a PhD philosopher and head of that department at the university in the 1920s by the name of Dr. Hartley Burr Alexander. He was brought into the team and provided all the inscription, some in painted murals, some carved in stone. He provided images of what the subject matter was to be in carvings on the outside of the building. He organized the entire thematic scheme, both on the exterior and the interior of the Capitol. He was asked by the university, you know, you're doing this for the Capitol, how about providing some work for us at the stadium, which he was glad to do. There are 4 corner pavilions, and the 2 inscriptions on the east side of the building that face campus were dedicated as memorial statements to those who'd given their lives in service to the state and nation. In commemoration of the men of Nebraska who served and fell in the nation's wars. Their lives they held their country's trust. They kept its faith, they died its heroes. Since this facility was to be about sports as well, there were 2 inscriptions installed on the corner pavilions on the West Stadium. Not the victory, but the action, not the goal, but the game. In the deed, the glory, courage, generosity, fairness, and honor. And these are the true awards of manly sport. Anyone can build a stadium. What you put into it, what you say you stand for, is more a statement of who you are as a people. I mean, he darn well knew that. And so he chose statements on the face of the stadium, if you take time to read them, talk about the merit of the activities to go on inside the stadium. Not the win-loss record, but how you conduct yourself, competing in those sports, representing our state. The stadium was essentially an east and a west stadium. The East Stadium, that which faced campus, was to be the main entrance. The real visual appearance of the stadium was oriented to the east, as it should be, the campus, where the students would enter, and that's still to this day the predominant student and faculty side of the stadium. The West Stadium, more the general public. And so the East Stadium and West were both clad with a facade. It had a whole series of arches along the exterior face of the building, and at the very center of the east side was this semi-dome, which was a semicircular recess into the face of the stadium with a half dome at the top of it. It had kind of coffers in it and bosses or flowers in the center of that dome. So it had some real antecedents in Roman architecture. It was meant to be a very impressive, make no mistake about it, where the front entrance is kind of expression on that side of the building.
It was a really quick build, really, because you're talking that, they're groundbreaking in April of 1923, but they're playing games in October of 23. But again, that's where you had the field could be made available, certain sections of the stand could be available, but the entire stadium was not complete at that time.
It still had wood frame holding the concrete. It looked a little too fresh to be safe, but I do think they tested it before they let people sit up there in the stands.
And in fact, I think there's a note where Parsons Construction Company, that was responsible for actually building the stadium, they just said, if you're going to be having fans in the stands in October or on these games, we're not going to be responsible for any injuries. The first game happened on October 13th in 1923, and that was against Oklahoma.
Nebraska won that game fairly handily, I think 24-0 or something like that. And the interesting thing about that was that Nebraska wore blue jerseys that day because Oklahoma had only brought its red ones. And rather than have them, both teams looking the same, Nebraska agreed to, we'll do the blue jersey thing. So that's the only time that Nebraska ever didn't wear red in a game.
And then the next game on October 20th against Kansas and Jayhawks is when it was actually dedicated. And at that time, they said it was 30,000 fans could come into the stadium. Now, sometimes, depending on the archival record that you're looking at, you might see that read as 31,000. And in fact, at one point, I found a citation where there was actually 47,000 possible seats in the stands because the intention was that you could bring in bleachers in an emergency situation.
Nebraska had begun a new chapter on campus and within the football program. Even though the stadium wasn't quite finished, the first games played inside ushered in a new era of winning football that only grew from there.
Thompson, now he's throwing end zone down the right side. Drops the throw in the bucket for a touchdown for Nebraska to Oliver Martin.
It's just one of those places it's hard to explain to people that don't know it, what a game day atmosphere Memorial Stadium is like. But it's one of the first things I remember coming here as a junior in high school on an unofficial visit. You're driving down I-80 and all of a sudden it's just boom, stadium. You see Memorial Stadium and like the tingles already start because you just know how magic that place truly is.
Nebraska is one of a handful of NCAA football programs with over 900 total wins. Many of those wins have come from inside their home at Memorial Stadium. Those memorable victories began that first season in 1923 with the second win in a row against the historic Four Horsemen of Notre Dame.
The last game at Nebraska Field, which had been against Notre Dame, there were 15,000, and then there were another 1,000 or so on coal piles, climbing telephone poles, climbing up into trees, anything to see this game against Notre Dame. The teams that had the Four Horsemen on them, Jim Crowley, Harry Stuhldreher, Elmer Layden, and Don Miller, those Notre Dame teams only lost 2 games, and both those losses were against Nebraska.
The still under construction stadium held a then record crowd of 43,000 as the Cornhuskers upset the Fighting Irish 14-7.
Anytime you beat a Newt Rockne team, that was a big deal, and Nebraska did it again.
As conference rivals dating back to the Missouri Valley in 1921, Nebraska and Oklahoma have shared in many memorable games throughout that time span. From 1959, when the Huskers upset the Sooners at home to break a 16-game losing streak, to the game of the century in 1971.
35 to the 20 to the 10. He's all the way home.
78 versus Oklahoma. That was one of the more significant games, too, because Oklahoma was number 1. Nebraska was number 4.
We hadn't beaten them for about 5 years, and people were getting ready to get rid of me, and we went out there and beat them 17-14. Jim Pillen recovered a fumble, and what most people don't remember is we held on to the ball another 3-4 minutes, drove the ball out, and didn't let them get it again. But it was a very hard-hitting game.
It was a really good Oklahoma team. Nebraska played really well on a cold day in Lincoln and won 17-14.
Over time, Nebraska gained a new heated rival in Colorado. The border battles were intense in the late 80s and early 90s, as both teams battled for control of the conference.
I remember the weather wasn't very good. Both teams were ranked, they tied for number 8 in the country, and you wouldn't have known that from the score.
I just remember it was all around Halloween. It was at night. 2 great teams, and they didn't particularly care for one another. That place just erupted. Our fans had a whole day to get themselves prepared for that night game, and they came prepared, and they were incredibly helpful in that game. We always knew playing here at home, we had a 7 to 10 point advantage. And that was in large part because we knew, our fans were very knowledgeable. As a defender, I mean, it was so loud, it was crazy. We had to have a lot of hand signals and calls. So the fans just made a tremendous difference and a huge impact in the game.
Nebraska won the game 52-7. I think people, for the most part, stayed to the end because they were happy about the fact that Colorado was the opponent.
Some games are remembered more for what they did for the program and community than the result on the field.
That game against Rice, I think, means a lot to our team, to me personally, just being able to be one of the first football games played, after 9/11. Football didn't really mean a whole lot, but on the other hand, it just meant everything. Because a lot of people lost their lives. And when you compare it to that, football, is pretty minimal. But then also to be one of the first games to be played on national television, to go out and kind of get back to normal. And then to honor all the first responders and veterans and local officers and to see, how much they felt appreciated that day. It was like we were playing for them. And I think that's what made it so cool and so rewarding to us, is that, kind of not playing football today for ourselves. We're playing this for other people and for the people that lost their lives. And that kind of just gave you this, wow, let's just go out and play and have fun and do our best and compete at a high level and let's, get this country rolling again. I don't even think I remember maybe one play of that whole entire game. It was for something different than football that day.
As the stadium has increased in size and capacity, it's been the site of loud moments from fans. From Eric Crouch catching a pass in the final quarter against Oklahoma to a school record kick, Memorial Stadium can be a thunderous environment.
As we went into the last game of the year against Colorado, we were really looking forward to ending the season on a high note. So really tried to build momentum into a good bowl game. Real tense game, kind of we're driving towards the end there. Third down, and Joe Gans took a sack. Pelini comes over and asks us if we can make it. A fourth down, and I think it was like 17, something like that. After we talked it over, I went up to Pelini and said I could make it. So from then on, it was kind of getting prepared mentally to go out on the field and try to kick a field goal that was probably the longest I've ever had. Actually was the longest I've ever had. And as a kicker, you kind of focus in and really make sure your mind's on the right things and focus on making it. And from then on, hit the ball well, got it just enough, and from there on, it kind of your mind and body take over, and it all happened so fast. So luckily it went in, and we ended up winning the game.
Ball right on the end. The snap is down. The kick is up. The kick is on its way, and the kick is good! Bangs it in there. 57 yards out, a school record to put the Huskers in front, 33-31.
Wow, this place is on their feet. I haven't seen Memorial Stadium like this in quite some time, fellas.
The wonder of experiencing a game at Memorial Stadium is a tradition passed down to each new generation of Nebraskans. The drive to fill the stands has been in full effect for over 60 years as the Huskers boast an NCAA ongoing sellout record.
What makes Nebraska Nebraska is things like, the sellout streak. It's things like these traditions that we hold really near and dear. The reality is, as college football and the world around us changes and evolves, our ability to be innovative ourselves. We got to this point because the University of Nebraska, Tom Osborne, our football program, was very innovative. We were doing things before anybody else. And so the challenge is, when you've had a history of success doing a certain thing, how do we thread the needle in terms of maintaining those traditions, but yet pushing ourselves to continue to innovate? That's going to be critically important for us to make sure that the sellout streak remains and that this stadium remains viable for the next 50 years.
In 1923, you had the bleachers on both sides, but you didn't have much more of that except the playing field. In January around 1926 is when they finally put the finishing touches on some windows and doors to make them look beautiful. And at that time, they had planned on creating medallions for each of the schools that were part of the Missouri Valley Conference.
So if you walked up there and you looked at the stadium and you'd say, what's Washington, Missouri? What's Grinnell College? What's Drake doing on the side of Memorial Stadium? They were conference opponents at that time. And all the conference schools are represented on the facade of the East Stadium. Sometimes it was a stunner for people.
Nebraska began the first series of expansion to grow Memorial Stadium beginning in the late 1930s. Hoping to create more locker rooms, offices, and other athletic department spaces, the university broke ground on Schulte Fieldhouse in 1939.
Schulte Fieldhouse probably should have been integrated into the original stadium plan, and it could be that it was, and those things were eliminated due to cost, but it provided sort of some breathing room for the athletic department.
They wanted to expand and have more opportunities for locker rooms, equipment rooms, and coaches and administrative offices. The first floor of the field house was just a dirt playing field. The third floor of the field house was meant to have courts for handball and squash, and then another indoor playing field for the football team. And you could also use it for track. They finally completed the entire facility, and then a couple years later, they dedicated it to Henry Schulte.
Schulte was hired from Missouri as a track coach because he was a great track coach, and he was an outstanding track coach in Nebraska. He also coached the football team for 2 years, 1919, 1920.
I always thought the field house was a really kind of a cool building. On the exterior of the north side of the building, it had the UN tiled letters. It had the big clock on the stadium side. The clock was huge.
It was a significant landmark in the same sense of the stadium. You know, Schulte Fieldhouse. Wow, that's pretty cool.
Schulte Fieldhouse also helped to connect to an indoor track installed underneath East Stadium.
We had an indoor track that was, it wasn't a perfect oval. It kind of went around like this, and I remember jogging down there, and we used to work our players out down there during the winter conditioning. But they had indoor track meets. And the thing that was always kind of interesting, they'd have the pole vault, and they had a beam there, and I could swear those guys were going to hit that beam when they got up around the 12-foot range.
It was used for a long time, even after the track team had moved away from it.
I think it was called Mushroom Gardens because it was damp and wet and dark.
It was covered with cinders, and probably wasn't a great environment as far as what you were inhaling, but at least it was someplace fairly warm where you could run. I don't remember anybody growing mushrooms, but it seemed like a place you could.
It was a cool thing, I thought, for its time. You know, obviously, when it got to be the Mushroom Gardens, it wasn't so cool anymore.
Since its completion in 1926, Nebraska had placed bleachers in the north and south end zones to accommodate additional fans who wanted to attend. The sections, known fondly as the knotholes, were the beginnings of what we know of North and South Stadium today.
The World War II generation grew up sitting in that knothole section, which was basically wooden bleachers down there in the south end zone, and then there was a much smaller set of bleachers in the north end zone for the girls. The boys sat in the south end zone and the girls sat in the north end zone. And I think it was super cheap, like 10 cents in the 40s probably.
When Bob came here in 1962, the previous season they'd won 3 games, I think, and lost 7 or 8. And Bob's first year, we went 9-2. And then demand for tickets continued to increase.
The interest in Nebraska football is such that by 1964, it's like, well, we need to start expanding.
As the team got more successful, They wanted stadium seats before they could sell real tickets. So the knothole section on the south was taken down and the South Stadium went up.
The stadium goes up from about 31,000, and by 1966, we're up to 65,000 seats.
The east and west sides were now connected with the construction of South Stadium. The horseshoe-looking structure still wasn't entirely connected, though, as fans couldn't walk from east to west stadium through a joined concourse.
The horseshoe would have lasted really only one or two seasons before the North Stadium went in, and that was right in front of the field house.
This new expansion in the north would cover the familiar site of Schulte Fieldhouse.
North Stadium, unlike its south counterpart, was done in stages. First, beginning in 1965, the center portion was built, adding 5,000 more seats. The following year, the wings on either side of the north end zone were completed, raising capacity inside the stadium to more than 65,000. And Cornhusker fans' passion was a leading cause for that increased seating.
There's no use expanding the stadium if you can't sell the seats. When Bob came here in '62, until Frank Solich left here, we won 82% of our games, which was about 60 more games than anybody else. And I think Ohio State was second at 75%. And so we went through a pretty good period of success on the field, and that certainly had to be part of it too.
First thing they say is great people. Every time, without fail, they talk about the people of Nebraska. They appreciate football. They know the game. Some stadiums, they don't know the game. This place knows it and they get it. When Big Red starts to come alive, the whole crowd comes alive. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it's always going to be. Look, this is one of those places that it doesn't change. It hasn't changed. It's not going to change. They love Nebraska football. It's always going to be that way.
The stadium is fantastic. It's the coolest thing ever. But if there's 10,000 people in it, it doesn't have the allure. It doesn't have the pull. Husker faithful to just show up week in and week out, and to the point where in my 4 or 5 years I got to know the people that had the season tickets right behind the bench, or the person that stood at the same corner of the tunnel walk every single week and without fail did not miss. Third largest city in the state when it's full, right? I tell people that all the time and they kind of laugh. I'm like, but it's true. It's not just something that is for the fans, but I think it's something that brings the state together.
Memorial Stadium status in Nebraska is unquestionable. A true touchstone of the state. The stadium has become intertwined in the lives of Nebraskans. It has hosted several concerts, from Farm Aid in 1987 to a sold-out show for Garth Brooks in 2021. A popular backdrop for wedding photos, and the new home for spring commencement. Nebraska's Old Gray Lady is more than just Husker football.
The west side of the stadium held all kinds of different things. When it was first built, we put in the auto repair shop. We had the head custodian live there. We had landscape architecture in there. And then one of the things that I think is really interesting is that they had the print shop there. So there's all these different pockets on campus that keep us connected to that concept of that stadium and the athletics.
When we do projects in athletics, we always try to to see if there's other uses, other partnerships across campus.
West Stadium grew to include the training table, where all student athletes could gather for meals, a student life center, and the home of the production unit responsible for the stadium big screens, Husker Vision. Memorial Stadium's ability to connect goes beyond the playing field.
The very first day we met, we both loved Nebraska football. And our kids loved Nebraska football.
My mom. Denny and Joyce Kornick have a unique connection to the stadium that brought the two of them together.
My father bought 2 tickets in 1929 during the Depression on the 50-yard line, halfway up in the West Stadium. I think he paid 50 cents. That's 90-some years that those seats have been sat in by my father's relatives.
I signed this 1954. My number is 31. Memorial Stadium to me is probably more important to many people because I ended up playing here. I did not only play football, but I also played baseball for the University of Nebraska. In football, I was an offensive running back, right and left halfback. And during that time that I was playing, we ended up having to play defense also, going both ways.
Happenstance would bring the two of them together later in life through a love of the University of Nebraska. The couple, who reside in Florida, travel back to the stadium for each home game.
My son is a retired pilot for Southwest Airlines, which allows us to fly as parents. So we have no excuses. We can fly back and see a game and fly back to Florida. We don't miss games.
Denny and Joyce have seen the stadium and team evolve over the years. Their passion and dedication to all things Nebraska shows no signs of stopping.
Listen, never coming back to a game as long as I can walk and talk and drive and steer and ride a horse. I will be coming back for Nebraska football. To me, this stadium is a shrine to all of Nebraska. Yeah. End of story.
I can be so proud that this beautiful stadium has added on very gracefully. My compliments not so much to the concrete, but to the people that sit on that concrete in that stadium. We have the best fans in the whole world.
That concrete structure had stayed primarily the same after the last round of expansions, which included the north and south seating. Plans for continued expansion were on the horizon as fan interest and wins piled up. But as Nebraska's athletic department would find out, they needed to secure what was there before more could be added on.
The one thing that was a rather vivid memory for me was that we had those expansions in South and North Stadium, but we still had the track. So the track ran underneath them. With that expansion, there was a support beam there at the southeast corner of the track. During games, they would put bleachers under there. And for some reason, somebody took that beam down because it kind of obstructed the track. And then we had a collapse.
It was the lower part of section 14. They had a removable column, and so they had decided to leave that out and add some structural components to that section. And then Small cracks developed, freeze thaw, and then there just wasn't enough structure in the end of a raker beam, and then it finally just failed. When the stadium collapsed in May of 1993, it was a major event. Could have been a disaster. If that would have happened during a game, I just don't know what would have happened. It would have been terrible. First, they had to investigate of what happened, what caused this collapse. And then secondly, they hired a engineering firm out of Chicago who specializes in more forensic engineering to come in and look at the entire stadium just to make sure that this wasn't going to happen again. And so for the next few years, we systematically repaired the stadium, and in some cases, we replaced about 50% of the concrete.
As the stadium was repaired and set up for the future, the football team experienced unprecedented success. The winning prompted the first in a series of large expansion projects at Memorial Stadium.
West Stadium expansion was kind of triggered because the original press box, which was built in the late 60s, had become really obsolete by the 90s. And that led to the skyboxes and the expansion and then the club seating.
First and foremost in my mind was to preserve the original stadium. We were able to memorialize the original facade in the concourses. The old footings of the stadium, they couldn't handle any more structure on top, so the only thing that's touching the original stadium is a rubber gasket at the top. The east and west sides are both independent structures of the original stadium.
In 2004, work began on a North Stadium expansion project that removed Schulte Fieldhouse, replacing it with a new structure that was modeled after its predecessor.
Originally, we were going to just build around Schulte and remodel it, but it just structurally just couldn't work. But we wanted to keep the features of the original Schulte Fieldhouse when we built the North Stadium and recreated it in a sense. One of the things, once it was decided that we were going to remove Schulte Fieldhouse, I wanted that clock off of there because I just thought it was something that we needed to preserve. But contractors worked for 3 weeks and it was so tied in to about 4 foot of concrete and brick that it just wasn't practical to remove. So we removed several key pieces of it, and then we were able to use those to recreate the clock in the concourse.
Finally, in 2013, Nebraska opened its latest expansion in East Stadium.
When we were building and planning East Stadium, I went to Coach Osborne and encouraged him to build the shell space that is now the Nebraska Athletic Performance Lab and then the CB3 lab. When we built West Stadium, we had this big, expansive area in the concourse that really wasn't put to use at all, and so we didn't want to make that mistake when we planned and constructed the East Stadium.
By that time, the Nebraska Cornhuskers had moved conferences and saw a rotating cast of coaches come into the stadium. The winning ways of the past had waned. Player development became a focus for success, and a new offshoot of the football stadium came into view.
This place really cares about football. You think about as time's gone on and all that has changed, it really just reaffirms the commitment that the university has towards its football program, how important it is to not just the university, but to the entire state.
In 2019, Nebraska embarked on the construction of a $165 million facility that would be connected to Memorial Stadium on the northeast corner.
Obviously, football is very important here, but there always is going to be a component of all of our student athletes. You put the academic support and the training table and life skills and some of that programming in there that affects all of our student athletes. But it really is part of the DNA of Nebraska. This is a place that's always believed in development. This is a place that's always tried to identify, overlooked student athletes with maybe a chip on their shoulder. I was one, that they could come in and develop, who were willing to work hard.
We did an evaluation of what our football facilities were. We went around the country and toured new facilities and just to see what others were doing. We just fell short on a couple features, especially on the recovery side for student athletes. We've never wanted to do something just because somebody else did it. We always were very thoughtful on what we're going to build and what we're going to bring online to make sure that it met our needs, not just because it was bigger and better than somebody else did it. We just want to make this facility more of a one-stop shop for our student athletes. Whether it's football or for all of our student athletes, it's right on campus, it's very convenient.
I'm not sure that I can think of any other school that's going to be more well-positioned than the University of Nebraska. Between our development facility, that's 315,000 square feet, a vision around modernizing Memorial Stadium, and the support that our fans have shown, we've got a great chance.
In 2023, the new facility opens and ushers in the latest phase of the stadium's footprint on campus. But changes aren't stopping there. Already in progress are plans for modernization to help Nebraska's Memorial Stadium continue to be a destination for all fans of college football.
We want to make sure that this place is still the place to be 50 years from now. It takes a lot of work because the world's changed. People's expectations have changed. People's mobility have changed. The size of all of us have changed, right? The way we consume live sporting events has changed. We can't be paralyzed in fear by change. Kind of really remarkable when you think about the guts and bones of a place that's 100 years old. Doing the very best you can to continue to embrace what was really special about this place when it was built in 1923. I love the fact that I can still go down in the concourse and go on the outside of the 100-year-old facade and still see the sign that says "Through these gates past the greatest fans in the world," and see the architecture and the brilliance, really, of it when it was built. It's pretty cool.
Hey, this setting right here, listen to this crowd. A very appreciative crowd. 100 years this stadium has been sitting here. And this is one of the iconic stadiums in our country, mostly because of the people who occupy it.
Who have sold it out for 60 years.
I think one thing that for me was always really important was you would always walk by those gates and they'd always be open. Even today, I was over there and I walked by, and one of the janitors who was throwing trash walked by, and he was just standing and they were looking out of the stadium, and he looked at me and he goes, "Never gets old, does it?" And I was like, yeah, it never gets old.
There's a great statement written by a man by the name of John Ruskin. And he says, "Therefore, when we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present delight or present use alone. Let it be such work our descendants will thank us for. And let us think when we lay stone on stone, that those stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them, and that people will say, when they look upon the labor and wrought substance of them, see this our parents did for us."
I'm biased. I think it's the most important building in our state. And I think it's representative of how athletics can be used as a catalyst to bring people all across our state together. And at the end of the day, you know, Nebraska as a state, our university, and our football program is at its best when everybody feels like they have a part of it. It doesn't matter where you live, where you grew up, what you look like, none of it. This is a place to assemble and bring people together that may have some difference of opinions on other things in life, but can they sit next to each other for 3 hours and cheer on the Big Red? That's pretty cool.
And the Deed, the Glory Memorial Stadium is brought to you in part by the Nebraska Lottery.